Welcome, everyone, to DEI After Five, the show that focuses on topics across diversity, equity, and inclusion with some of the brightest minds in the industry. Here's your hostess, inclusive culture curator and coach, Sacha Thompson.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of DEI After Five. Now, for the past few years, I have focused my work on psychological safety. But part of that has been focused on organizations and what they need to do to create psychological safety. And recently, when I celebrated the 4-year anniversary of the equity equation, I had to be reflective and why did I even get into this work? And it really was around not being in an environment that was psychologically safe for me. And so what can we do as employees when we feel that we have no power, right? We have no agency or voice. So my guest today is Alida Miranda-Wolff, who is the CEO of Ethos Talent. And we are going to really dive into what employees can do, what individuals can do when they're in that situation. So Alida, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So for folks who may not know you or what you do, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Absolutely. So I am a diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging practitioner. I've been practicing in the space for over a decade, and I came to the work through kind of a circuitous route. I started out in higher education and nonprofit work, and then I transitioned into venture capital. When I worked in venture capital, I started out on the deal side and then worked on the growth side of our portfolio companies. And in that process, came to understand that I was focused on issues of identity for a few reasons. The first was I wanted to see more diversity in the companies that we were investing in. We were not investing specifically in women and people of color in terms of our founder base, which is an ongoing issue in venture capital today. Not only that, though, when I came into that firm, I was the first woman ever hired full-time. I was the only Hispanic person working in venture capital in the city of Chicago and one of 32 Latino women working in venture capital in the country. And when I became a director there, I was the youngest director by 10 years nationally. I was often facing stereotypes or assumptions, and I wanted to make the environment better for myself while also creating the conditions for more types of people to receive venture funding. So that's how I came to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in a more formal way. Started using that term, building initiatives, and essentially doing the work not only for the VC firm, but also for our portfolio companies, which ultimately led to 6.5 years ago founding my firm, Ethos, which is a full-service diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging transformation firm. We think about it as a worker advocacy group. So we do consulting, facilitation, mediation, training, but ultimately it's all centered around this idea of how do we create the conditions for employees to thrive, even as the world becomes more and more difficult to navigate. So I will say that when I wrote my first book, Cultures of Belonging, Building Inclusive Organizations That Last, the timing was really interesting. I wrote the proposal and started getting that book deal. And then a few months later, George Floyd was murdered, the national protests started, and the demand for the book changed, the stressors inside of organizations increased, and I spent quite a bit of time building the model out into a practical format because I wrote Cultures of Belonging specifically to help with the folks who came to me and said, we can't afford a consultant, we can't afford a coach, we can't afford a facilitator, what can we do? The transition for me in the last year and a half has been that as we've seen the backlash around DEIB and we've seen the increased politicization and polarization of DEIB, I wanted to think more tactically because people still have to work for paychecks, even as initiatives are being rolled back, as investment in these areas are being cut. And so I wrote my second book, The First Time Manager DEI, because of the thousands of employees that I've interviewed for our equity audits at Ethos, one of the most consistent things that they say is that their manager relationships and their peer relationships are what have the most direct impact on their day-to-day well-being.
Absolutely.
And so that's what that book is centered on, and how we are also getting connected here today, because ultimately what I am focused on is, even when it feels like so much is out of our control in the workplace, we still have opportunities to improve our own experience and those of others.
It is always lovely for me to meet other people that have started their careers kind of in this space in higher education, right? I started my career in higher education. Um, and so I think that there's something uniquely special about that experience, because you do see just this conglomeration, this mass group of individuals from different backgrounds trying to figure it out. And depending if you're on the academic side or the administrative side of things, right, your role in trying to help people navigate these spaces. And so I think it's just a natural tie into diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And then you talking about venture capital, and right now what's happening with Fearless Fund, and there's some other organizations out there that are really struggling right now because of this backlash and what that looks like. And I saw a statistic the other day that said, and I'm gonna use Fearless Funds specifically, where they are trying to fight for more than just 2%. Right. So this backlash is over 2%, because that's the amount of money that, women of color particularly get in this space. And so these are the things that are, come top of mind. And then how does that play out into the workplace? And I appreciate, this holistic view that you all have in this, because organizations are made of individuals, regardless of what level you are on. And so we all play a role, but we also have to understand what our role is in this space and what we can control and what we cannot control. And I think more people feel that there's less in their control than there actually is, right? How you show up is in your control. How you want to be as a leader is in your control. And so really understanding what that looks like. And it's funny that you talk about the tactical pieces of this, because I often hear, right, okay, well, what do I do? Right? It's great and have this theory, but what does it look like every single day? And so that's, again, we're pretty much in the same space of how do we take this theoretical conversation into a practical, day-to-day, tangible, what does this look like for me? And so I want to go into really thinking about, okay, we're in this place where companies are pulling back on their DEI efforts, rethinking the commitments that they made in 2020. There's so much happening right now. And I think that there are many employees that are out there trying to figure out, especially if they are from an underrepresented or minoritized group, what does this mean for me? Right? There's a message that's out there of, hey, we're rolling back. This work isn't working anyway. We've decided to, whatever. You're sending that message out to the world, but you're also sending that message to your employees that may be impacted by those things. And so what are some things that employees need to think about right now as they're seeing all of this swirling around them?
The first thing I want to highlight is, as much as we are talking about the ways in which organizations are pulling back and specifically pulling back on DEIB because they say it's not working. The numbers of employees who support these efforts have not changed significantly. So Pew Research showed that 56% of American workers believe that DEI should be taking place in organizations and that these programs should continue, which is about the same as it was in 2020.
Yeah.
So I want to highlight that because it brings forth one of the main challenges that we're seeing, which is as more and more organizations have conducted layoffs in the last 2 years, as we have seen a tightening of the economy and increase in interest rates, as employees have shifted from having more power because there weren't enough people to fill the amount of open jobs in 2020 and 2021. In 2020 and 2021, the issue that we're seeing now is the interest and the demand from employees is the same, but their job security is not guaranteed. And so,
Yeah.
what I'm also hearing from employees is they want to advocate for these programs, they want to see them in place, but because there's that sense of job insecurity, they are staying silent or being more mild or trying to be persuasive rather than, let's say, rabble rousing. One of the reminders I like to give employees, especially employees from historically resilient groups or minoritized groups, is you start with your circle of authority. So, where do you have the most impact day to day? And that is most likely your team. So, you can, with your personal culture, impact the 3 or 4 people you work with every single day. It's such that in small organizations, I often call every new hire a cultural co-founder because how you show up will ultimately impact the culture of that organization. So if we have, for example, employees who are concerned that their voices will now take a back seat, I encourage them to work to put structures in place on their most immediate teams that highlight those voices. One of the most basic practices that any employee can introduce is suggesting meeting agreements or community agreements, where we say for every meeting we hold, we're going to have the same 3 or 4 rules that we all follow and that make sure that everybody has the same share or voice in a conversation. This is the kind of action that often shows initiative, that's reviewed well in a performance review, that has less pushback
Right.
from folks because it benefits more than just the minoritized group, but ultimately can protect their voice in a meeting or in a conversation. I also encourage folks to think through what would be the one thing that would make the biggest difference for them in their day to day and think about how to structure it durably so that if they introduced it and then went on leave or took an extended sick time or transitioned into another role in the organization, it would remain even though they aren't there, so that they aren't creating structures that are fully dependent on the weight resting on their shoulders. This is a main challenge that minoritized groups face, where they do have these gains and these wins, but they're white knuckling their way through it. So,
Yep.
what is the structural solution? And a lot of what they come up with sounds like just good workplace practice. But if you look into the psychology and the research around it, it's really focused on social identity groups. So, an example of this might be we often hear that people of color are less likely to receive communication from their managers, their peers, and their direct reports around the status of projects and updates, which increases a sense of anxiety in the workplace and makes it harder to track towards deadlines. Introducing a simple practice of saying we all confirm receipt of email, even if we don't respond with an answer right away. So within 24 hours, we let people know that we saw it and we're getting to it, is a practice that you can introduce that is non-confrontational, not high stress, and that ultimately, again, protects you from having to shoulder the weight of what is unsaid or unspoken. Because the other thing that I'll say, after spending so much time with employees and organizations, they often cite hidden discrimination as being the main challenge that they experience day to day. That does not mean that harassment and discrimination in the more traditional forms doesn't happen. Of course it does. And it happens in places where people wouldn't imagine that it does. This is a big part of my firm's investigation process. That being said, when we talk to employees, they cite examples of hidden discrimination, which is essentially not that folks are going out of their way to harm them for their differences, but that they're going out of their way to help others who are like them. So
Yeah.
opportunities are not being extended, or when their colleague is in a room with leaders, it is someone like them that they're talking up, not a colleague who's coming from a different identity group. So, how we mitigate hidden discrimination is by doing as much as possible to make the implicit explicit.
Yeah. You know what? I love how you all are approaching this because it ties so well with psychological safety. Like, how do you create environments that are psychologically safe? This is what it looks like, right? These are the actionable things that can happen on a team or within an organization. And, as I'm listening to you, I'm like, yes, like these are the cultural norms that need to be redesigned on a team. And these are great examples of what that looks like, right? So the response to, like, yes, email received. You don't need to, have a full response, but the fact that I know you've received it forces me to not go through that process in my head of did I send it? Did they see it? Did they not like, because we do that. We have this self-doubt as individuals, and especially people that are from communities that have been marginalized. We second guess a lot of things when we're not getting responses, or we see people whispering those. I mean, it's just human nature. And so how do you start to eliminate some of those barriers? Because that's what those are, right? How do we start to eliminate that and create these new norms where everyone feels like they're included? Everyone feels like, okay, my voice is being heard. We're all on the same playing ground, level playing field here. And then that piece that you spoke about where people may not go out of their way to help other people, but aren't conscious of who they are actually helping is so, I've experienced that, right? I've seen that happen. And then I've called it out. And then all of a sudden I'm sensitive, right? I'm like, am I sensitive, or am I just calling the thing a thing? Because, right. And then you're actually sensitive because I called it out. So I love how you all are really looking at what does this look like every single day, right? What are we experiencing every single day? And how do you start to dismantle some of those cultural norms that have created an exclusive culture, right? Or created pockets of exclusion that you may not even realize are there. So talk to me a bit about, because we've talked about kind of the employee side of things. And I truly believe that as a leader, and you spoke about this a little bit, but as leaders of these teams, right, you are in a position to kind of see all of the pieces and how they play together. And so what is one thing that leaders can look out for when they are really trying to be cognizant of what's happening within their team, their specific team that they manage and control?
One of the main ideas that I have been sharing with leaders is to not consider accountability and inclusion to be at odds with one another. This
Oh,
is a challenge that leaders bring up for me all the time. They'll say, I can't hold people accountable and still be empathetic. Or
yeah.
I may hold people accountable, and as a result, they are going to feel the weight of all of the adversity that they faced. It's something that Brene Myers has called sloppy sentimentalism. We
Yeah.
don't give people feedback that they need because of the identities that they hold. And so the framework that I like to teach is we hold ourselves and others accountable. And accountability does not mean that we are just bringing down the hammer on people.
Right.
Instead, it means high expectations, high support. So what does that look like? High expectations means that we get crystal clear on what the goals are. What do our employees need to do for us in order for them to be successful in their roles? And then high support is, how do we give them everything they need to be able to reasonably achieve that goal? It's the combination of the two. We don't combine them enough as leaders. We either set really high goals and say, figure it out, sink or swim,
Yeah.
or we don't provide them even with the opportunities to be accountable. Where I think some of this comes from is a belief that accountability is remembering and holding over someone a mistake that they made. But being able to say, you made a mistake today, and I don't want to see this happen tomorrow, but I believe that you won't make this mistake tomorrow, is
Right.
different than assuming that because you've made the mistake, this is who you are and what you will do. So the example I give, I've been trying to give manager examples, but the one that resonates the most with leaders is actually about my 2-year-old. So high expectations, high support. My 2-year-old is a very obstinate individual, willful. He likes things to go to his plan. And when they don't go to his plan, he becomes emotionally distressed. So if he's
Mhm.
having a tantrum, it is because we are changing course from something he wants to do. So if we're at the park and he doesn't want to leave, but we have to go to dinner, I am not negotiating with him. I am not saying we're going to spend another 5 minutes here, or, okay, if you stop crying, you can go on the swings one last time. That wouldn't be holding him accountable, and it wouldn't be
Right.
holding myself accountable. The goal is to get to dinner on time. However, I can recognize that he has become emotionally distressed, and I can provide him with support. In this case, I will say, please take your pacifier, use that to soothe you as we transition from the park to dinner. Now, if the goal was to wean him from the pacifier, I would give him another support tool in that situation. But the point being, whenever we're working in an inclusion environment, we need to be able to both understand that we must value and respect the people we're including and give them what they need to succeed. It's the two together.
Yeah. You know, like you're speaking my language. And I love it because, I talk about, the piece of this work that we often forget is equity, right? And I look at equity work as, how do you provide support or remove barriers, right, in order for people to be successful? And that's exactly what you're talking about. It's that accountability piece is a part of that equity work. And we've skipped over it because we're like, oh, we like the inclusion part. Oh, we like the diversity part. But the hard, icky middle is that accountability piece. We had a guest not too long ago that talked about appropriate accountability, because we were talking about cancel culture and what that looks like. And so I loved that phrase of appropriate accountability because it looks different, and it's not always a punitive measure. It could just be a correction, or it could it could look in so many different ways. And I think because corporate culture for the longest time has been very binary, and it does not operate in that messy gray area, that it's difficult for us to understand that accountability is not always firing or punishment, right? Like there are ranges to what accountability could look like. And I love, in that example what you shared was, accountability is, there's two parts to it: holding that person accountable, but then also holding ourselves accountable. And so as a leader, what does that look like? What is our bar for what we tolerate and what we don't tolerate? Or how are we holding ourselves accountable in these situations? Because we can easily get out of them and put the onus on someone else. And so I love that you were looking at it from that two-part perspective, because that's a big part of what's happening in the workplace. The other thing that came up for me as you were talking, I was in a meeting not too long ago where I was talking to two leaders. One is like on the verge of retirement. And I was, talking about how leadership now really is, you have to have a bit more empathy, right? You have to understand what that person is dealing with and operate from that perspective, talking about emotional intelligence and all of those things. And what came back to me was, I don't have time to coddle people. And so in my mind, I'm thinking that's old school leadership, right? Like that is not necessarily what is going to be successful moving forward. So as I'm listening to you, there is a shift. I would say generationally, but I think a big part of that is just personality wise as well too. But there's a shift in what leadership looks like now. And so as we're talking about empowering employees in the role of leaders, what does that shift look like? Or to you, what, in your opinion, what does the shift look like as we move forward in a time where this work is being attacked, right? If it goes away or not, right, I think this shift is going to continue to happen. So where do you see it going in the next 5 to 10 years?
So the first thing that I want to address is that example around coddling, because I hear it all the time. And I specialize in disability and neurodiversity. Those are two areas that my firm focuses on. I'm a person with disabilities. I'm neurodivergent myself. It has a lot of meaning to me. The idea of coddling ends up showing up when we have employees asking for basic accommodations that are protected by law. If I have ADHD, I am protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. But there are a lot of ideas about what it means to have ADHD, and it's associated with personal failings, that
Yep.
you can't focus, or you're distracted, or you just need to buckle down and work harder, in a way that if we had an employee who was dealing with cancer treatment, we wouldn't respond in that way. But as we continue to see a mental health crisis amongst workers, as we see people being more open about the fact that they are neurodivergent,
Mhm.
this is happening more and more. And so this piece about coddling, what it makes me curious about is, what needs are not being met for you, leader, that you can't
Mhm.
even consider meeting a need for your employee. So if we
Oh,
if we assume that this is too much work for you, and we take that at face value, what aren't you getting? So instead of
right.
placing the blame on your employee, what do we need to consider? And I'll give you an example that I think is tied to this coddling example that you provided. So there's a manager at one of our organizations who has an employee who recently disclosed being on the autism spectrum. And as part of being on the autism spectrum, they have certain needs around how information is delivered. Their listening comprehension skills are not at the same level as their reading comprehension skills. So they have asked for a reasonable accommodation, which is, if you make requests, please either put them in email or in our project management system. The
Mhm.
manager is saying, that's too much work for me. What's the point of having a one-on-one with you if I can't just tell you what I need and you do it? That's your job. Why do I have to now spend 5 to 10 minutes documenting it somewhere else? And if I look at that without trying to place blame on either party, I would ask, why, as a manager, do you not have 5 to 10 minutes to do it? It's
Right.
not an issue with your employee. It's an issue with your work structure and potentially with your manager and your team setup. What we want is to look at the conditions that would allow for you to say, yes, I can put that in an email, no problem. That's a reasonable request,
Right.
as opposed to feeling overburdened. And I think it's also related to a larger shift we're seeing in this country. There was a New York Times article that came out in September, a daily podcast about it yesterday, that's about the trauma of intensive parenting. So this idea that parents according to the Surgeon General, are in the worst mental health state that they've ever been because the demands placed on them are too high. So they have full-time jobs, but they're also spending more time with their kids than any parents previously, and they have fewer people to support those kids. So they're not living close to their family members, their neighborhoods or community organizations are not available to them, and so they're feeling overworked, not just in their work, but at home too.
Right.
And so what I go back to is there are generational differences. And some of these ideas are coming from the rugged individualism of American culture, which is I'm the only one. I'm the only one who can do it. All of this pressure lands on me. Everything falls on me. So when I think about employee advocacy in the future and what actually advocacy for human beings looks like in the future, we have to adopt a more coalition-based approach. If we are thinking about constantly negotiating between my individual needs and your needs, we're going to be in a failing proposition because we live in a community together. And so we need to be building our workplaces so that everyone's needs are being accounted for and they're not at the expense of someone else's. And hopefully my dream and vision for this country, which who knows what will happen, is that the same is applied outside of the workplace too, so that we are able to lead more balanced lives overall.
Yeah. I mean, part of the reason why we do this podcast is because, yes, these conversations happen at work, but they impact our communities as well. And so there's no borders to inclusion. There's no borders to emotional intelligence or understanding, how you show up for others, because whatever you're doing at work, you're probably doing at home, to some degree as well too. And so, one of the things you said just now there were a couple of things you said that I was like, pfft. But that really stood out for me was that piece around rugged individualism in American culture. And I've talked about that several times on this show. And, what I have started doing was really looking into non-Western ways of thinking and learning. And there's, books around that. And outside of, I will say, supremacy culture, because that is global, almost every other culture has a communal element to it, right? How they value elders, how they look at the youth, how they support each other in community. And so I am seeing this shift to, we are lacking so much of that in our personal and professional lives that is where people are going to find some level of wholeness. Right. So I don't know if you've noticed, but I've noticed a whole lot of small communities popping up, communities of practitioners, communities of whatever it is, just so that there's this safe space for people to be able to lean on each other and protect each other and grow professionally. And so as you were talking, I'm like, there's absolutely this need for community and empathy. And that statement that you made, I had to write it down, right? Like, what is it that you need that you're lacking so that because you can't support this person? That's a powerful question, right? And so how many people have actually thought about that or taken the time of, and this is going to come out in a crazy way, but the reason why I'm ornery is because I've not gotten what I need, right? How many people have actually thought about that? And how is that impacting how you show up for others? And so as I'm thinking through this conversation I had the other day, it is, wow, like, okay, so what is it that you need that you're not getting? Because if we were to fulfill that for you, would that change how you show up for other people? And if the answer is no, then it's something else.
Right. And there's an exercise that I recommend people try. I did it on myself recently. I was testing it out because I was helping one of our clients who designs curriculum for youth, and they are making personal statements, personal mission statements. And so I did it and I realized I need to be doing this not just with kids and teens. I need to be doing this with my managers and leaders. So you draw 3 circles and each circle has a different label at the top. One of the circles says my protectors, the people who fiercely defend me in any situation. Another circle says my nurturers, the people who take care of me when I have needs. And the third circle is my wisdom holders, the people I look to for guidance and insight. And all the exercise is going through and writing down names in each of the circles. And as you go through, they can be people who are immediately in your life or in your workplace, or they can be characters from books, figures from history, examples that you look to. So I was testing it out to see, could this exercise be done reasonably in 5 to 7 minutes? As I went through the exercise, I had a major insight, which is I didn't have anyone in my protector circle. And so I asked myself, how does that show up for me at work? And the way that it shows up for me is I feel very much that I have people to turn to when something goes wrong, that I will have a support system. But when I'm in the thick of things, I feel very unprotected and vulnerable, which means that when I'm going into a high stakes client meeting, for example, my anxiety shoots up. And that shows up in the way that I carry myself and in the way that I actually relate to my work. So I find that it's a lot easier for me to hold space for people because I have somewhere to put that energy afterwards. If I have had to take on a lot of difficult emotions for my coaching clients, I have somewhere to put that out. But if I'm being faced with a lot of anger or frustration, I don't feel that I have someone in my corner who's fighting for me. And so now I know that actually what my goal is to find more protectors to fill my circle with, because that will give me a sense of being settled when I have to face difficult day-to-day challenges. And this is something that any employee can do. And also something for managers to think about. Which of these circles am I filling for my employee? Because I should be in one of them. Maybe I can't be in all three. Maybe I can. But I should be fulfilling some of these roles because a big part of being a manager is showing care. That's what you're doing. You are a steward and a guide for the people who report to you.
I'm like, my wheels are turning because I, outside of all of this work, do a leadership development program for an organization. And I'm going to try that with them. I'm just going to see what comes up. And I think it's very powerful because it also, one of the questions that I could ask on top of that is, which circle do you try to be a part of? Because now it's like, oh, I don't try to be, So this is how you're showing up kind of in this space as well, too. So I love that. Okay. So we need to do a little bit of a pivot, and like there's just so much. Like my wheels are just turning all over the place. How do you fill your cup? Like, what are the things you do to take care of you? Because just listening to all the things that you all do, this is a lot. And, knowing what this industry is going through right now on top of all of that is heavy. So how do you take care of you during these times?
So I'm actually, my cat is really in the way, as you can see, but I will show you. One of the things that I do is I bedazzle books. So there are like 3,000 crystals on this right now. And the practice came from years and years and years of me having a mindfulness practice. I was a meditation instructor. I went through teacher training. I was somebody who would meditate for 45 minutes a day. And then 2 years ago, after I had my son and I went through a lot of personal crises, I found that I couldn't access my breath in the same way and still feel safe. That was around the same time that I finally received my diagnosis for post-traumatic stress disorder. And so one of the ways that I fill my cup is these artistic projects that have a mindfulness component to them. So I do make art. I bedazzle books. I spray paint storage materials. I paint canvases. I screen print. writing is a big outlet for me. So I've written 2 nonfiction books, but I've also written 4 fiction books. And one of the things that's been really useful for me is by focusing on the fantasy genre, I can imagine future possibilities, which I found to be, especially in 2024, essential as I am increasingly finding the present to be too much or too overwhelming. The
Yeah.
last thing that I'll say is my colleague, Taylor Elise Morrison, who's a coach and who's also written several books, including the excellent Inner Workout. She put together an inner workout assessment. She defines self-care as listening within and responding in the most loving way possible.
Mm.
And so that's something that I ask myself when I feel like my cup isn't full. I ask, what would be the most loving thing I could do for myself right now? And sometimes the answer is taking a hot bath in the middle of the day. But a lot of times it has to do with what I'm getting rid of, what I'm eliminating, what I'm letting go of. And so it's not necessarily me going on Instagram or TikTok to look for new wellness tips. It's about saying, I'm doing the best that I can today, and maybe I can only give 70%. Or I
Yeah.
have 12 hours of work worth to do, but I'm only going to do 6 today. I'm going to finish 2 hours early to spend extra time making a dinner I really want to eat. And so that's been part of it as well. But what you're describing, I think, is an ongoing challenge, especially because one of the things about living in communities is it's not just your own baggage that you're holding.
Yeah.
And so while you do have the support of others to hold for you, you have to be able to do the same for them. And so I think that this constant self-inquiry and self-reflection of what do I need that will make me feel loved by myself is critical.
That's beautiful. I mean, and again, that can show up in so many different ways depending on what is happening, right? And so many, and I love that response because, when I ask guests this question, it shows up in so many different ways. And that, what do I need right now to love myself, could be a massage, right? Could be. And as you said, yesterday I had 8 hours of work that was on the foundation that I'm the executive director of. And I made the conscious decision. I'm like, that's all the work I'm going to do today. I have some other stuff I need to do. It's not saving the world today, or, like I can put that off. And I felt okay with that because anything else would have led me to feeling burnt out or felt like, oh my gosh, okay, I can't give anymore. And so it's honoring those moments and being okay with stepping away when you need to step away. So I appreciate you sharing that. So Alida, if people wanted to get in contact with you, what is the best way for them to do that?
The easiest way to reach me is through my website, alidamiranda-wolff.com. You can also email me at alida@ethostalent.com. And the nice thing about me is not only am I on LinkedIn pretty regularly, but I am the only person with my name on LinkedIn, Alida Miranda-Wolff. It means that logging into any security building is impossible for me, but it also means if you're doing an online search, you're almost always going to land at me. So those are the places you can find me.
Wonderful. Alida, thank you so much. I mean, you have given us just so much information, and I think people will walk away, as I always say, with a nugget or two that they didn't have when they came in. So I truly appreciate that, and really just rethinking this, what do I need right now to love myself? Yes, I'm on that. So thank you so much for being with us today. And thank you all for tuning in to this week's episode. I mean, I am just full. My cup is overflowing right now. These are the things that I love to do. If you found value in this, please be sure to like, share, subscribe, tell your friends, tell your colleagues, because this is truly a community of giving information and sharing, and hopefully something that you can learn or teach someone else. You can find us here every Tuesday at 5:15 p.m. Eastern on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And until next time, have a good one.